Having covered the basics of SharePoint and the major moving parts, it's now time to turn our attention to doing the installation of SharePoint. Now, what we're going to see is the basic requirements in order to install SharePoint, both from the hardware, software, and user account perspective. Then we're going to take a look at doing our installation interactively. We'll talk about the different steps that need to take place. And then we're going to polish it all off by talking a little bit about how to automate installation. But first up, let's talk about the different prerequisites that we're going to have in order to install SharePoint. First of all, from the software side of things, we're going to need to have Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2008 R2 with Service Pack 1. Keep in mind that regardless of which version it is that you choose, it does need to be 64-bit. Additionally, there are roles and software that need to be installed. Now, these will typically be handled by the prerequisite installer, and that would include things like setting up the application server role, which is going to give you IIS, .NET 4.5, the WCF data services, App Fabric, and a whole host of others. Now, one of the nice things about the prerequisite installer, as we're going to see, is that it will automatically download everything from the internet, which is also one of the bad things is the fact that it's automatically going to download everything from the internet, because it is possible that your server might not be connected to the internet, or you're just simply trying to improve the performance of your installation. But we'll talk more about the prerequisite installer in a later section. On the hardware side, your hardware requirements for SharePoint are going to vary based on your setup. So if I'm setting up a single server with SQL installed on the same box as SharePoint, and I'm not necessarily going to be doing a whole lot with it, maybe I'm just looking for a little bit of testing, maybe I'm just trying to kind of check out the new interface, then in that scenario, 8 gigs RAM will actually work just fine. However, if you're trying to stand up a box for full testing purposes or maybe full development purposes, where you're going to have every service installed, things like search, user profiles, MMS, things that are really going to potentially slow things down, in that environment, you're going to need, at a bare minimum, 24 gigs of RAM to get an acceptable level of performance. However, if you're going to be standing up a web server or an application server in a farm where SQL is going to be offloaded, my applications are going to be offloaded, then the minimum requirement is going to be 12 gigs for that environment. Keep in mind, like we talked about earlier, that when we're talking about our different services, our needs are going to vary. So your requirements are of course going to vary depending on your usage patterns and your network. You will notice that there is a link to the TechNet article that explains in detail every single piece of software and all of the hardware requirements. So if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty, you can check that out. As far as SQL goes, you do need SQL Server 2012 or SQL Server 2008 R2 with Service Pack 1. Keep in mind that once again, SQL must be 64-bit. Now, if you're curious as to which to go with version-wise on both the Windows Server side of things as well as on the SQL Server side of things, my personal recommendation is just to go with Server 2012. After all, that's going to give you the longest supported life cycle. That after a while, Server 2008 R2 is no longer going to be supported. So you may as well just go straight to 2012 and be done with it. There are different user accounts requirements in order to set up SharePoint as well. First of all, in order for me to set up, actually run the installer for SharePoint, I'm going to need a couple of different permissions. First of all, I will need to be a domain user. I'll also need to be a member of the local administrators group on that box, which, if you stop and think about it, kind of makes sense because I'm going to be making a lot of changes to that system. I'm also going to be making a lot of changes on the SQL side of things as well. I'm going to need to be a security admin and a DB creator at a bare minimum. DB Creator will give the installer the ability to create the databases as me, and then Security Admin will give the installer the ability to change permissions so that way I can have DB Owner to the databases that I've just created. If you've decided that you maybe want to pre-create some of these databases so that way you can place them maybe on certain files, then you're going to need DB Owner to any of the databases that have been created. SharePoint is also going to need a few different accounts in order to be able to run. Now, all of these accounts need to be domain user accounts. Now, one of the very nice things is that as far as the underlying permissions go, when you run the installer or you run psconfig a little bit later, the installer and psconfig will automatically set up the bare minimum set of permissions that's going to be needed. That being said, however, there are going to be a couple accounts that need to be created, and we are going to want to know what it is that they do. First of all, we're going to need a SharePoint farm account. Now, our SharePoint farm account is going to be, first of all, the application pool account for central administration. Second, it's going to be the account that will be used by the SharePoint Foundation 2013 timer service. The timer service runs a whole bunch of just behind the scenes things that help make SharePoint do its magic. We'll also want to create a separate application pool account for SharePoint. Now, this is going to be the identity for all the different application pools that we're going to be creating. Now, keep in mind that when we create an application pool, one of the biggest things that we have the ability to do is to change the context for that application pool. So if, for security purposes, you have a web application or a service application that needs to run as a different account, you can create additional accounts as needed. In most typical environments, you'll create the one account and then configure your application pools for your web applications and your service applications to use the exact same account. And then finally, last but not least, we're going to need a default content access account. Now, this account is going to be used by the crawler service to read content for indexing. As far as the requirements go for the default content access account, it's not allowed to be a member of farm administrators, and that's a security thing. Because the only thing that the default access account needs is simply read permissions to the data that's going to be indexed. It doesn't need write permissions anywhere. Now, when I go to run psconfig, which is going to actually set up my farm and ask me for these accounts, the only account that I'm going to need to know right up front is just simply the SharePoint farm account. But soon enough, when I get in and I start creating my different service applications and my application pools, I am going to need that service application pool account. And when I go to set up search, I'm going to need to know the default content access account. Let's take a look at the installation process. Installing and getting SharePoint up and running has 4 basic steps. Step 1 is to install the SharePoint prerequisites. Step 2 is to install the SharePoint binaries. Step 3 is to run the SharePoint products configuration wizard, also commonly known as psconfig. And then finally is to configure our farm. In this lesson, we're simply focused on the first 3 steps. Install SharePoint, the prerequisites, and the binaries, and then run psconfig. As far as configuring our farm goes, that includes things like setting up the different web applications that our users are going to connect to, and our service applications, and that's going to be the focus of a lot of the remainder of this course. Let's take a look at installing the SharePoint prerequisites first. I'm going to connect up to the DVD, which I've got right over here on my D drive. I'm just going to double click, let it launch the splash screen. And then from there, I'm just simply going to hit the little link to install the prerequisite software. It's going to list everything off that I need. And I just simply click Next. Choose to accept the license agreements and hit Next again. And now this will go ahead and automatically download everything from the internet. Now, while this is downloading in the background, the one little thing that I do want to mention, and we'll talk a bit more about this later on in the lesson, is the fact that you can pre-download everything and script everything out to make things go a little bit faster. So that way your systems don't have to be connected to the internet. That way you're not having to wait for everything to download from the internet as well. I'm going to have to wait now. A couple of real quick things to note about the installer. You are going to notice that it's going to take a few moments because it has to download everything from the internet. Fortunately, there is a possibility for us to pre-download everything and create a little answers file to tell the installer where everything is, and that's something we'll take a look at a little bit later on in the lesson. One of the other things to notice, and you'll see it as the demo rolls in the background here while I'm talking, is the fact that there is a reboot that is required. One little thing to note about the reboot is all you have to do is log in, and it will go ahead and pick up where it left off. You'll notice on most of your systems, depending on your connection, that this will take probably about 5 to 10 minutes for everything to successfully install, counting the reboot time. Once the installation is complete, all we have to do is just simply hit Finish, and then we can carry on with actually installing SharePoint Server. The next step is to then install the SharePoint binaries. Now, when you go to install the SharePoint binaries, that's of course going to be done by utilizing setup.exe. When you run setup.exe, it's going to ask you what type of installation you want to perform. Do you want a complete installation, or do you want a single server? With a complete installation, what's going to happen is it's going to install everything that SharePoint might need and get it ready to work in a farm. That's the option that you want. On the flip side, however, single server is going to install an internal version of SQL Server for SharePoint to use. Now, keep in mind that that internal version is going to have the same limitations as SQL Express. In particular, it's going to be limited to 10 total gigs of data, so it's not going to get you very far. On top of that, if you decide later on, hey, we kind of dig this SharePoint thing, we want to break this out into a farm, unfortunately, your only option there is to reinstall SharePoint. So single server is great for temporary testing servers. I just need a server up and running right now. As far as production goes, not so much. Let's take a look at doing our installation. Let's kick back over to our bits, and let's double click on setup.exe. It's going to ask us for our product key. It's then going to ask me to read through and agree to the license terms. Hit continue. And then, as promised, it's going to ask me the type of installation that I want to perform. You'll notice that the default is complete, and that is the option that I basically always want. You're also going to notice that it will ask me about my file location. You can, if you want, move the binaries for SharePoint to a different directory. It's not really going to improve performance at all, so you may as well leave it where it is. You are going to notice, however, that it does ask about index files. If you are going to be utilizing SharePoint Foundation Search, and this is going to be running queries, you're going to want to make sure that that's moved off to a different location. Fortunately, if you simply forget to do this during the installation, you can change that later. Let's go back to server type. We'll hit install now. And then with blinding speed, amazing accuracy, and the magic that is video editing, you'll notice that we are now done. Now that my installation is complete, it's time to turn our attention to psconfig, or the product's configuration wizard. Now, before I hit close and let it automatically run that, let's talk a little bit about what psconfig is going to do for us. If this is the first time that we're running psconfig on the server and the farm, what this is going to do is establish the farm for us. It's going to do that by setting up our config database, setting up our central admin web application, and also asking us for a farm passphrase. That farm passphrase is going to become key whenever we go to add additional servers to the farm. Now, when I add an additional server, it's going to ask me where the config database is, and then for the passphrase for that farm, so that way it can join in to the farm. Let's take a look at running psconfig. So I'm going to hit close. It will then launch psconfig automatically for me. I'm going to click next. It's going to give me a little warning saying, hey, we got to restart some things. I'm okay with that. So I'm going to click yes. And then it's going to ask me if I want to connect to an existing farm or create a brand new server farm. If you say connect to an existing, it's then going to ask you again, config database, farm password. In my case, I want a brand new server. So I'm going to put the dot next to create a new server farm. I'm going to click next. It's then going to ask me for my database server, my server name for my database server, SQL 2012 primary. You'll notice the default database name for config database, sharepoint_config. Personally, I like all my databases to be sharepoint underscore, just because if my DBA goes in and they want to see all the SharePoint databases, it's much easier if they start with SharePoint underscore. It's then going to ask me for that database access or that farm account. And remember again that this is going to become the app pool for central administration, and it's going to be the account used for the timer service. I've already created an account. It's just a normal domain account. I called it very creatively SharePoint 2013 farm, and then my super duper high secret password. And then it's going to ask me for my farm passphrase. Now, this is something that should be extremely long, so that way it's not going to be easily guessed or cracked. Keep in mind that if you do forget this later on, with a little bit of PowerShell, you can go back and change this later on. I'm going to use a relatively simple one, just so as I remember it later on. And then I'm going to click Next. It'll then ask me about central administration. You can let it randomize the port number, or you can specify your own port number. Personally, I always use 4242. Remember that modifying port numbers doesn't actually buy you anything with security. And one of the big things about SharePoint is we want to be able to administer this remotely. So by specifying a port number, now I can remember later on what this was, and 42 is of course the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. Down at the very bottom, I can choose NTLM versus Kerberos. We'll talk more about Kerberos when we get into security, but the big thing about Kerberos is it does require I go in and create a series of service principals for all the different services that are going to be running both SharePoint as well as SQL. If you want to enable this later on, you can always go back and change it. I'm going to click Next. I've got the list of everything that it's now about to do. I'm going to click Next, and then once again, with blinding speed, amazing accuracy, and the magic that is video editing, we are now done. I'm going to click Finish, and once I do that, what you're going to notice is that this will then launch the homepage for central administration for me. Now keep in mind that at this point, that's all that I have, is I just simply have central administration, nothing else that's fancy. Now you may notice that this is going to take a couple of moments. Now you're going to notice that it will ask me here if I want to sign up for the customer improvement program. I'll let you guys decide on your own if you want to. And then it's going to ask me to run the configure your farm wizard. Don't. The thing about the Configure Your Farm wizard is that this is going to create a whole bunch of service applications, databases, and web applications for you, and it honestly makes a lot of bad decisions. That the naming scheme that it's going to choose is going to involve GUIDs, that it's going to set up user profiles in a way that isn't necessarily optimal. And so because of that fact, you're going to want to go in and do everything manually. So we'll come back at a later point and take a look at central administration. But you'll notice that we now have SharePoint installed. What happens if we're trying to make our lives a little bit easier and we want to automate the installation of SharePoint? Well, if we want to automate the prerequisite installer, we can do this by downloading all the prerequisites in advance and then executing the prerequisite installer with either a series of individual switches telling it where each file happens to be, or we can create an arguments text file with the list of all of the switches. Now, I've actually already downloaded all the scripts. You'll notice that I've provided a link to a couple of cool PowerShell scripts. One that will actually download all of them for you, and then the other two, which will configure the Windows roles that are required for SharePoint, and then install the prerequisites for you. The prerequisite installer file, as we're going to see, has everything all set up for us. As far as creating the little answer file that you're going to need for the prerequisites, unfortunately, you have to create that arguments file all on your own. Fortunately, if you take a look at the little link that's provided there, they've got the set up the steps, the instructions on how to go in and create that. I'm going to open one up in my demo, and we'll actually talk a little bit about everything that's going to go into there. So if I go in and I go to my prerequisite installer arguments.txt file, if I open this up, this has the list of all of the switches. Now, a couple of real quick things about this arguments text file. Number one is that it needs to be everything on a single line. Number two is it does not handle the reboot really well. That in the middle of doing the prerequisite install, there is a reboot that is required. Unfortunately, this doesn't handle that real well. So what you'll need to do is let it reboot and then run it again. The last thing to mention about this arguments text file is that if it's in the same location as the prerequisite installer.exe, then I can call this by just simply running the prerequisite installer right from the command line, or even just from the UI. That if I just come into here and I just double click on this, it will automatically read that arguments text file. So that way, if I put this out onto a network share, all the binaries, and I want to install SharePoint on a new server, and maybe I want to do it interactively, I can still do it interactively and have it use local copies of all of the files that are needed for the prerequisites. That's pretty slick. On the flip side, for our setup config file, we can do this by creating a config file. You'll notice that Microsoft has given us a series of samples that we can use inside of the files directory. So depending on the type of install that you want, all that you need to do is just double click on the appropriate folder. There is the config XML file. Let's open that up inside a notepad. And then all of the options that I'm looking for are automatically set up. Now you are going to notice that there's two main options inside of here. Server role, which could be single server or complete. Remember what we talked about. You want complete. And then you'll also notice the setup type, which is either going to be clean install or upgrade. The big thing that I will need to edit inside of here is going to be the PID key section. Just simply uncomment that and then update that with your product key. And then, when I'm ready to go, all that I would need to do is navigate to the appropriate directory, and then setup.exe/config, and then the location of the file. Now I do want to mention, as far as psconfig goes and getting all of that set up, that unfortunately isn't as easy to run straight from the command line. That's going to require a bit of PowerShell, and again, PowerShell we'll talk about in a later lesson. But until then, thanks a lot.